There's a specific type of World of Warcraft player who looks at the game and doesn't just ask how to play it well, they ask how far they can push every single system before something breaks. And across the many years of classic content we've now had between Vanilla and Wrath, those players have come up with some genuinely unhinged discoveries. Some of these were harmless fun or things which Blizzard ignored that you can still do today, and others completely broke the game in absolutely unintended ways. And when you hear about some of the techniques people used, you will wonder how people even came across them. But the journey to get the highest DPS or the fastest run through a raid never ends, despite it being difficult or easy. So these are 10 of the most degenerate min-max methods we've seen in classic World of Warcraft so far. And number 10 is something which is very creative but has to come low down on the list just because it's so well known, and that is the Alliance faction being able to pick up the Warchief's Blessing buff. So Warchief's Blessing is a Horde world buff, and it's always been that way. The clue is very much in the name. When a Horde player completes the quest for the Horde, they turn in Rend Blackhand's head inside of Orgrimmar, and about 6 seconds later a buff will drop for everyone inside of Orgrimmar and the crossroads called Warchief's Blessing, giving them a bunch of health, mana per 5, and most importantly 15% melee haste, and that's what really matters here. Of course, with vanilla content, warriors have always been the best damage dealers, so anything that makes your warriors do more damage is super important. However, this is a Horde only buff, there's no question about that really, and yet Alliance players figured out if they got mind controlled as the buff would drop, during that mind control their faction would temporarily change from Alliance over to the Horde, allowing them to effectively get this buff. So people who wanted to min-max absolutely wanted Warchief's Blessing. It is one of the most powerful world buffs out there, so Alliance players would travel deep into Horde territory, often finding safe spots inside of Orgrimmar or outside in the crossroads, and wait until the buff would drop. After that they'd either have to be mind controlled by a Horde priest, or have somebody on the Horde use a gnomish mind control cap on them, which would temporarily change their faction and allow them to pick up the buff. Now usually with this quest there is a 3-hour cooldown after you hand it in before you can get the buff to go out again, but with layers on our mega servers now it's become much easier to pick up the buff. Did you know that during Season of Discovery, Blizzard finally created an Alliance equivalent of this called the Might of Stormwind, so that players didn't have to mess about with any of this? And Classic Era briefly had this buff as well, but enough people complained that it was changing the meta of the game that Blizzard ended up removing it again, because apparently enough people prefer going to Horde territory and getting mind controlled instead, so I guess each to their own. Blizzard patched out you swapping faction when you're mind controlled right at the start of TBC, so any future interactions like this would no longer exist. But to this day, if you're really trying to min-max on Classic Era, or Vanilla in general for that matter, you'll be venturing into Horde territory to pick up your Warchief's Blessing. Before we go on, a quick word from today's sponsor, Boo.dev. Boo.dev is a platform that aims to equip you with the skills to get on board with a career in back-end development through interactive lessons and learning. Instead of boring video lectures, they throw you into hands-on learning from day one, and you'll learn back-end web development from start to finish in Python, SQL, and Go. Crucially, you'll be writing tons of your own code throughout your entire journey and building real projects that mirror job responsibilities. There is plenty of help available on this journey too, such as Boots the AI bear. He's been trained on every single lesson and knows exactly what you're learning, and when you get stuck, he won't just outright give you the answers, but instead ask you follow-up questions so you can understand what you've done wrong and get back on track. And even if you're just curious and want to see what it's all about, all the content is free to read and watch, and there is even a 30 days no questions asked refund policy. So really it is risk-free, and if you may be interested, then why not give it a go? You can also head down to the link in the description and use my code Willie for 25% off your entire first year for Boot.dev. Thank you as always to Boot.dev for supporting the channel. Let's get on back to WoW. And number 9 is a method of min-maxing which doesn't even involve starting the raid whatsoever, and that's fishing for a good ID inside of AQ40. So if you've ever done AQ40, I'm sure you will know the nightmare that is the trash between Twin Emperors and Cthulhu. It is widely considered the worst part of the raid by a huge margin. In fact, if Blizzard just lowered the amount of trash in this corridor, I think people would treat AQ40 a lot more kindly. But as we know the raid, it's always been a nightmare. Among the trash in there are roaming packs of enemies with Karaji Slayers and Karaji Mind Slayers, and the distinction between these two matters a lot. The Slayers are melee enemies which are relatively straightforward. They deal a bunch of AoE damage, which is very much manageable. The Mind Slayers, however, are a big problem within the raid. They do two things which really harm the speed of your raid. Number one is mind controlling random players. Obviously, if you have 20-something warriors in a raid, which speedrun guilds very much will do, then if one of them gets mind controlled and the other warriors are all spamming cleave and whirlwind, they're going to pretty much one-shot them, so that's absolutely no good. Secondly is when mind slayers die, they trigger a mana burn effect, which also has a horrify tied onto it that will fear all nearby targets. You don't always have an ability ready to deal with this, and it just slows you down either way. However, the amount of slayers and mind slayers that spawn per ID is random, and speedrunning guilds figured out that they could effectively roll for a good ID before even engaging within the raid. The method was having priests cast mind vision throughout the instance, hopping from boss to scout out Cthulhu's corridor. Once they were there, a weak aura would figure out how many mind slayers were in that particular ID, and if it was way too many, you would simply zone out, reset the raid, zone in again, and hop back to those trash packs via mind vision again. And you can repeat this as many times as you want. So if you're a priest, you're bored, or you're trying to set up for a speedrun, you could spend hours and hours looking for a good ID, and when you finally find one, you just wait inside the instance for the raid time to start. And number 8 is one of the most weird yet technically beneficial consumables in the game, the Humble Boggling Route. This one requires you to go all the way back to the Night Elf starting zone in Teldrassil and complete a very specific quest line. You work through Denelyn's tasks in Dolinar, eventually triggering the Glowing Fruit quest, and when you turn that in, 3 Bogglings will spawn next to his box. You kill those Bogglings, collect the roots, and you're done. Those are the only roots that you can get on that particular character. Unless that is somebody else spawns the Bogglings, you steal the tag and loot them instead, which I'm sure happens occasionally. And what do boggling roots do? They give you 1 bonus physical damage for 10 minutes. Not 1% or any form of multiplier, just 1 bonus damage. At a first glance, this seems just like some random flavor item from a starting zone. Vanilla's full of stuff like this after all. However, this buff stacks with other similar effects, and as we've already gone over, melee classes in vanilla are pretty good, so anything that does make you do more damage is beneficial. So if you're really going all out, then you can go and farm boggling roots, but you'll either have to do it on a new character each time and farm them up, or maybe go and borrow some other people's tags. It's not like they're going to use them too much anyway, is it? And number 7 is what people call the Green Mana Potion. Flask of Distilled Wisdom was primarily used by healers during vanilla World of Warcraft. The reason is that Flask of Supreme Power only gives spell damage, and spell damage and healing power are different stats in vanilla, so really you do have to use this one if you want to pop a flask. What people found though is it didn't just increase your maximum mana by 2000. If you were below that threshold, say at 100 mana, and you drank a Distilled Wisdom, it would set your current mana to 2000. You can probably see where this is going, and this is why people called it the Green Mana Potion, because if you're in a speedrun, you're going as fast as possible, you're constantly healing or dropping totems or whatever it may be, you just don't have time to sit down and drink as much as you would want to. So what do you do other than just chain pop flasks of Distilled Wisdom to keep your mana bar going and your melee group alive? This was particularly useful on the Horde because they were more reliant on their mana whilst healing. You see, on the Alliance side, Alliance have Paladins, and Paladins have incredibly good mana efficiency because whenever their heals crit, they gain 100% of the mana back, and that obviously stacks super well with world buffs. Horde Shamans do not have anywhere near as good mana management, so there have been speedruns on the Horde side of the game where players are popping literally dozens of flasks in a single raid just to keep up. It's extremely expensive and not something you do every week, but if you're really trying to min-max, then this is a great example of it. And number 6 is perhaps one of the shortest lived min-maxes we've ever seen in this game, the 48-hour Fire Warrior during Wrath of the Lich King Classic. Surprisingly, there was a decent amount of new min-maxes that came out during Wrath. You'd think all the weird and degenerate stuff would happen in vanilla, so this was a bit of a surprise to me at least. However, when Wrath of the Lich King came out, one of the underlying mechanical changes was that crit critical strike rating was turned into a unified stat. Previously, you had melee crit and you had spell crit as two separate things, and when it was combined, some unintended consequences arose from it, and one of those gave birth to the Fire Warrior. So what is that? Well, Deep Wounds is an Arms Warrior talent that causes your critical strikes to apply a bleed effect, dealing a portion of your weapon's damage. And in a world where crit is crit and there's no difference between spell crit and melee crit, well, this Deep Wounds effect was proccing from spell effects. However, warriors don't have spell effects, do they? Unless they started to equip random things which did do spell damage, such as using the Fiery Weapon enchant from vanilla, or using Fiery Plate gauntlets that had an on-hit effect that dealt some bonus fire damage. Suddenly, warriors were fishing through all these old random spell damage based procs from vanilla and seeing how many of them they could stack up on their items, because that Deep Wounds proc was doing a really good amount of their damage, and this wasn't a massive DPS gain either, and warriors were absolutely sitting towards the bottom of the DPS meters at the start of Wrath. They really were bad then. However, when Blizzard caught wind of this, they patched it pretty much immediately, and they said in the notes, Deep Wounds no longer triggers from non-physical damage, such as the Fiery Weapon enchant, because as much as it was a funny way to min-max, it was also highly unintuitive to go and equip random spell power procs from vanilla, so I think I can see why they changed this fairly fast. And number 5 is Feral Druids and how they interacted with the weak Troll's Blood potion. You just don't get a list about doing weird min-max stuff without having additions from the Feral Druid on it, and this one does require some extra context about what Blizzard did to Feral Druids in TBC Classic. So the core of Feral DPS was power shifting. In vanilla, energy ticked on a constant server-side timer that ran continuously, regardless of what form you were in. So if you shifted out of cat form and back into it right before the tick, you would gain 20 energy from the tick, 20 from Wolf's Head Helm, and 20 from your Fiora talent, allowing you to cast way more shreds in your rotation compared to just sitting in cat form. Now in original Burning Crusade and patch 2.2, Blizzard changed how power regeneration worked across the whole game. Each player would now maintain their own personal regeneration tick timer, and any change to your personal regeneration rate would reset it, and it would grant an immediate partial refund of energy based upon your old rate, and then start the fresh ticks at the new rate about 2 seconds later. This was designed to improve abilities such as Evocation or Innovate, where if you started them on a bad tick, they would just lose a tick out of their entire duration. However, for Feral Druids, it quietly destroyed the power shifting playstyle, because entering cat form was a regeneration event that reset the tick timer, meaning you change into cat form, not get the energy tick when you should have, and have to sit there waiting for the next event to happen. The rotation was pretty much completely destroyed. Here's where the weak Troll's Blood potion comes in. Some Feral Druids figured out that any change to any form of regeneration reset your personal tick timer. Now, weak Troll's Blood potion is a super low level consumable that provides a tiny amount of health regeneration, but if you drank this consumable before you entered cat form during a power shift and then cancelled it when you were in cat form, this would count as resetting your personal tick timer, allowing you to always get that energy tick whilst you're in cat form, as you would have been able to under the old energy system. So the macro was consume potion, power shift, cancel buff. This meant you'd be consuming and then cancelling a weak Troll's Blood potion every couple of seconds to maintain the correct tick timer for your energy window. On a 3-minute fight, you go through about 40 weak Troll's Blood potions. Blizzard eventually brought the energy tick behavior back to the constant 2-second loop that vanilla used, making this whole Troll's Blood energy potions thing unnecessary. But for that brief window before the fix, Feral Druids were doing something monumentally degenerate. And that is not all about Feral Druid, because in Wrath of the Lich King, they came up with something entirely new, and that is bear weaving. So Feral by Wrath standard was considered one of the more complicated rotations in the game. You're tracking your dots, you're managing your energy, you've got Savage Roar, and you've got all your combo points to deal with too. But some players took it even further with a technique called bear weaving. One thing you should also know about Wrath of the Lich King is that Blizzard changed how energy regeneration worked, so your typical power shifting just wasn't a thing anymore. In vanilla and TBC, it was 20 energy every 2 ticks, and power shifting was very much built around this. In Wrath and Beyond, energy would be constantly regenerated at a much more smoother rate rather than you getting it in big chunks. So this led to scenarios where in cat form you had downtime. So what did people do? They shifted into bear form and started using abilities in that form instead, primarily stacking up Lacerate and using Mangle. After you've got your Lacerate stacks up and you use Mangle, you go back into cat form, the Fura talent gives you a burst of energy, and then you're doing cat things such as Shred, maintaining dots, Savage Roar, and so on. And then you're going back into bear to maintain those dots as well. And that's why it's called bear weaving. On top of that, there was something else feral druids were doing in Wrath as well, and that was spamming Gift of the Wild during downtime or during the pre-pull. The reason was that Gift of the Wild in Wrath would go on every single player in your raid, and it could proc Omen of Clarity, which would make your next ability free. And because Gift of the Wild was going on your whole raid, the chance for it to proc Omen was extremely high. So again, during periods of downtime, people would just pop out of cat form and cast Gift of the Wild on their raid to try and get a free shred. And that was on top of bear weaving as well, by the way. The result was feral druids were doing marginally more damage than they would have otherwise. However, Blizzard came along and gave them a significant buff. This happened sometime during Ulduar. They said Omen of Clarity will now always trigger when Fairy Fire Feral is used on a non-player, non-pet target. At the same time, Omen of Clarity will no longer proc from Gift of the Wild. This change is intended to smooth out feral DPS gameplay for most players and resolve many of the social and gameplay challenges that were created by the so-called bear weaving combat strategy. In many situations, bear weaving not only increases the mechanical complexity of a class to a degree that was far above what was intended, but it also places strain on the raid to keep up with the druid's additional threat generation. This guaranteed Omen of Clarity ended up being a significant buff for feral druids, which made them arguably even stronger than they should have been by later raids in Wrath of the Lich King. In fact, during the start of ICC, Blizzard were considering removing this buff, but I believe feral druids managed to convince Blizzard to hold off doing this, and so cats with their very sharp claws in some cases ended up out DPSing people with Shadowmourne. Feral druids were definitely one of the biggest winners of Wrath of the Lich King after this change, I can tell you that. And number 3 was staying in Wrath of the Lich King for a rather ingenious way that rogues min-max their AoE damage. So the brand new AoE ability for rogues in Wrath was Fan of Knives. This hit nearby enemies with both your weapons for 70% weapon damage, or if you were wielding 2 daggers, 105% weapon damage. And this was just something you could spam on trash, didn't generate combo points back then on your primary target, and would just let you keep up to some extent on AoE. However, rogue players found a combination of weapons and talents which let them be the best AoE DPS in the game, which no one expected. So first of all, you were playing at least some variation of Assassination Rogue. A really important talent was Focused Attacks. This made it so every time you dealt a critical strike, you gained 2 energy back. And then we have to look at the daggers they were using. The first and the most important one was Fell Striker. This is of course a dagger that drops from the Ren Blackhan event in UBRS, and has absolutely no relevant stats for a level 80 character, aside from the proc, which was a chance on hit to make all attacks to be guaranteed critical strikes for 3 seconds, and it was around a 4% proc rate. Against a single target, 4% proc rate, not very good, but when you're hitting 20 targets with both your weapons using Fan of Knives, it was pretty much guaranteed to proc instantly. This meant rogues using Fan could always crit, and when they were always critting, their focused attack was giving them 2 energy per crit. So using just these 2 things, Fan of Knives was paying for itself, and it was just infinitely spammable on enough enemies. However, you also needed a main hand weapon to go with this, and what people initially used was Titan Steel Spellblade. This was a main hand that was designed for casters, as you would expect from the name, and was ordinarily never going to be used by a rogue. However, it was the slowest main-handed dagger at the start of Wrath of the Lich King, which meant it had the highest weapon damage that would scale with Fan of Knives 105% multiplier. It was just funny though, because on trash packs, your ideal pair of weapons were a main hand that spellcasters were supposed to use, and a dagger from a level 60 dungeon. This was always working as intended from a mechanical standpoint though, nothing was bugged here, and Blizzard never changed it. And number 2 is how engineering was used in TBC for speedruns, and this one is absolutely crazy. So Ultra Safe Transporter Toshley Station, or the Goblin version, are engineering items crafted during TBC, which will take you to different places in Outland. Now when you use this Ultra Safe Teleporter, one of the outcome is that it will change your character's model for 1 hour. One of those possible outcomes is making your model into that of a Tauren. Now of course Tauren, having the largest model in the game, actually have slightly higher attack ranges than other races, meaning for a melee class they would usually be good, but they lose out because their other racials aren't as good as other choices. However, this engineering item has a 4-hour cooldown, so really it would be highly impractical to try and get this debuff on your entire raid before a speedrun happened. That was until someone found out about a rather creative way you could use this engineering item. It turned out if you Alt F4'd out of your game with half a second left on the cast of this item, you would get one of the potential debuff outcomes without it actually going on cooldown. So players who were looking to speedrun would spam this item, Alt F4 out the game, log back in, see what debuff they've got, and repeat it until they have the ones that they're looking for. And this didn't stop at the Tauren model either, because the debuffs have multiple outcomes and they all stacked with one another. There were 2 others which minorly increased your character size too, such as the Soul Split Good and Evil transformations. And top guilds who wanted every advantage would aim for the Tauren, the Soul Split Evil and the Soul Split Good debuffs. And this wasn't about just attacking a little bit sooner because of the extra model size. On the Felmist encounter, you could actually attack her while she was in the air if you stacked your entire raid on top of a cart and jumped up and down with all these character size improvements. And if you ever go back and watch some speedruns, you'll see their entire melee stack are these absolutely enormous Taurens swinging away with glaives, which is just hilarious to see. And as far as I know, I don't believe Blizzard ever even changed this either. And at number 1 is the Blade of Eternal Darkness Blackwing Lair pre-clear bug. So Blade of Eternal Darkness is an epic dagger that drops from Maridon from Princess Theradras. It has a chance on hit to deal some shadow damage and restore 100 mana with a pretty low proc rate. This is usually used by mages AoE farming because every instance of Blizzard can proc the on-hit effect, meaning essentially if you're pulling enough stuff you never go boom, which is obviously very good. However, it was used in an entirely different way in Blackwing Lair, and the class that made the most out of it were in fact priests through Mind Vision. So Mind Vision, as I'm sure you'll know, is not a damaging spell, it just lets you see through an enemy or an ally's eyes, and priests discovered that using Mind Vision on an enemy had a chance to proc the Blade of Eternal Darkness, dealing 100 damage to them. And of course, when the enemy took damage, they would enter combat and then start pathing towards the thing that had dealt damage to them. So for example, when you're in Blackwing Lair and you're doing the Razorgore encounter, you have a lot of downtime whilst you have that one guy destroying all the eggs. So what better use of that downtime than to spam vision on trash packs later in the raid, fishing for Blade of Eternal Darkness procs, so they would come running around down to the raid. And yes, these trash packs would run up from the room above Veilstraz, down the ramp, and through the gate into the Razorgore encounter, allowing people to clear out all this trash whilst just doing Razorgore as they normally would. This was obviously a significant time save, as it was making the trash clearing massively more efficient. Later still, players also discovered another scouting application for Priest Mind Vision inside of Blackwing Lair. This was very similar to what happened in AQ40 with people scouting how many Mind Slayers there were in an ID. You could Mind Vision all the way to the end of the instance and see which brood power the Worm Guards had. The absolute worst brood power is the bronze one. This is the one that makes the tank spin around and deal massive damage to everyone nearby. So you could zone in and out and fish for an ID with no bronze powers, which would make this section of the raid significantly easier. Though I believe in some later speedruns, people just invisibility potion past pretty much all the brood guards, making this section of the raid trivial anyway. I believe it was the Horde Guild Calamity that first did the Mind Vision Blade of Eternal Darkness pre-clear, and I think that has to be one of the more clever ways people have min-maxed their way through a raid. And there we have it, what for me are 10 of the most degenerate and strange min-maxes we've ever seen in Classic's history so far. You never know though, people are always cooking up new things and trying to fish out new ways to make the raid a little bit faster. So despite the game being so old, there's always room for discovery. Let me know if you've been in a guild that's ever tried any of these techniques or played a class that's made the most of some of them either. Shout out to Boot.dev for sponsoring this video. You can check them out for free via the links below and get a start on back-end web development today. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.